In this lecture, we are going to add a color palette to our block. WordPress offers a component for rendering a selection of colors to the client. Adding it to our block will be as simple as importing a single component. In the previous lecture, we were introduced to a package called Components. Check out the resource section of this lecture for a link to this package's documentation page. We are going to borrow another component from WordPress. This package houses various components for rendering input elements, such as a color picker. Take note, this package can be found under the Packages directory. This is another package that can be found under the official Gutenberg repository. Let's read the description together. This package includes a library of generic WordPress components to be used for creating common UI elements shared between screens and features of the WordPress dashboard. Below the description, we are given installation instructions. However, we're using the scripts package. This package will give us access to the other packages without installing them. Scroll to the Docs and Examples section. If you're interested in viewing the various components offered by this package, there's a link you can check out from this section. In fact, let's take a look together. WordPress uses a tool called Storybook. This tool allows developers to document their React components. On the sidebar, we are given a complete list of components exported by this package. You can click on them to view their implementation. Let's take a look at the Color Palette component. As you can see, an example is given for this component. We can interact with the example to view its behavior. This component is perfect for our needs. At the bottom of the page, there's a list of properties with their name, default values, and description. If you would like a concrete sample, a button at the top left corner says Docs. On this part of the page, an example of the component is given. Overall, I highly recommend bookmarking this site. It'll contain the latest examples of all components exported by the Components package. There's one more thing worth noting. On the sidebar, there's a section called Experimental. Gutenberg is constantly evolving. There are experimental components that aren't stable. If you plan on using these components, use them with caution. They can change at a moment's notice. Let's get started with adding the color palette to our block. In your editor, open the block.json file. To get started, we will create an attribute for storing the color selected by the client. Inside the Attributes object, add an attribute called _color. Color values can be stored as strings. Let's set the type property to string. Next, let's add a default value. As we've learned, WordPress will not give our attributes a default value. In some cases, we may want to provide a default value, such as our color. We can add a default value for an attribute by adding a property called default. The value for this property will be the following hex code, #F87171. This value was the original color from the static example. Our attribute is ready. Time to work on adding the color palette. Open the index.js file. We are going to update the import statement for the WordPress/components package by adding the color palette component. Next, scroll to the Edit Functions JSX. Inside the Panel Body component, replace the inner text with the color palette component. The component can be added as is. However, we should modify the component's properties to modify our block's attributes. To begin, we should add a series of custom colors for selection. On this component, add a property called Colors. The value for this property will be an array. The array can contain a list of objects. In each object, we can specify a color. Let's add an example. Inside this object, add a property called Name. The value for this property must be a human-readable name. Clients can hover over our color to view the name. Let's set the name to red. Next, add a property called Color. The value for this property can be a valid CSS color. Let's set this property to the following value, #F87171. Let's add another color. The second color will have the name indigo with a color value of hash 818CF8. After adding colors, we should attach our attribute to the color palette. There are two properties that need to be modified. Firstly, we should initialize the color palette with the current value in our attribute. Secondly, if a new color is selected, the attribute should be updated with the new color. For the first property, we are going to need the attributes. To keep our code readable, let's destructure the underlined color from the attributes object. Next, on the color palette component, set the value property to the underlined color attribute. The value property will configure the current color of the color palette. Afterward, let's add an event listener called onChange. The onChange event gets fired on a new color selection. We can pass in a function to handle what happens after a color is selected. Let's pass in a function that accepts the new value as an argument. Inside the body of the function, we are going to call the setAttributes function. As we've learned, the setAttribute function will update a block's attribute. Let's pass in an object to change the underlined color property to the new value argument. Our block has multiple attributes. Regardless, we do not need to pass in a value for other attributes. WordPress will only update the attributes that are passed into the object. The other attributes will persist their current value. Time to test our block. Refresh the editor in the browser. The block may be broken. You may have to re-add it to the editor. After doing so, you should be able to select the block. On the sidebar, the color palette component will render a UI for selecting a new color. We should be able to toggle between our two colors. Just to make sure, let's change the color and update the page. Next, let's refresh the page. After doing so, the color of the block should persist, thus proving that WordPress is keeping track of the color. Great! We've got a functioning color palette. The next step is to apply the color to the block. We're getting really close to finishing. Let's wrap up the development of our block in the next set of lectures.